All right, folks, we're going to ask you to find your seats. Make sure you get back to the exact place you were in the first session. We can't be mixing up our seats, because then we'd have to meet new people. I want to take an opportunity to thank Brian for all of the elbow grabs I'm going to be receiving tomorrow following worship. But he'll be here with me, so you can grab his elbow too. All right, folks, now that we're settled in, let's get into the second session. Let's welcome Brian back.
Can I just say, one of the toughest jobs in the world is being a pastor, so we should appreciate these good people who take on this challenging role in these challenging times. In our first session, we asked, what's our current situation? And what I'd like to do is share with you 4 scenarios of what we might expect going forward, and that will lead us to what I think is our most important question in these times. Funny thing happened on my way to being alive. I got born on May 4th, 1956, and so I turned 70 in just a year, and I got curious recently, and I found out that the New York Times has all their archives available, digitized. So I went and searched, and I read the New York Times on the day I was born. And I felt like I was seeing my whole life unfold from the first day of my life just by looking at the headlines. This is one of the headlines: "Mankind warned of its extinction." I thought, that was on the day I was born. And if you read down in the fine print, someone gave a lecture. Dr. Chisholm said that North America now is consuming about half the world's total irreplaceable natural resources. And then you read the next sentence, he says, he indicated, however, that this would not continue for more than 10 years. Not because we'd reach the end of the world, he said, but because the underdeveloped countries were beginning to realize the importance of their resources and would use them for their own purposes, which you can see would accelerate the use of resources. He called for a re-examination of man's prejudices and attitudes and said that unless this was done, the human race was doomed. And I realized maybe I was doomed to write a book with the word doom in the title from the day of my birth. Since the book came out, there have been 2 main responses to the book among people who've read it. People over 45 almost always say chapter 2 was hard. And we're going to go through chapter 2 right now. And then they tell me, but it was worth it. People under 45 tell me chapter 2 was amazing. What a relief. And maybe you can see why there'd be that difference. Among those of us who grew up in one context, trying to look at our civilization, our way of doing life as a species, is very hard to think that it won't last forever. For people under 45, for whom it's more obvious that it's not working, to have somebody say what's obvious to them has felt like a relief. And of course, that's how that process goes. For those of us who are older, we've been around long enough, we have more to let go. But for folks who never felt like the system that they inherited was sustainable for them, it's a lot less to let go, and I think that will make a little more sense going forward. I just realized there's a typo there. That should say Brene Brown. Brene Brown said, "We are not socially, biologically, cognitively, and spiritually wired for," I'm paraphrasing because we're in a church, "for some of the stuff going down right now our lives are somehow unfolding faster than the human nervous system and psyche are able to manage well. So before I talk about the 4 scenarios, I want to give you a little way, a fresh and I hope useful way of thinking about your own psyche, your own nervous system, because everything that we're talking about today involves a bit of a jolt to the nervous system. I hope that what I do in the next couple of minutes will give you some new language. For those of us who are Christians, we inherited a whole set of language that was the state-of-the-art technology for the time when it was written to describe how the human person works. We were given words like mind, heart, spirit, and flesh. That was the best language we had for to try to describe what we were about. Unfortunately, in religious settings, often that language then becomes absolutized. Things are not understood as metaphors, but they're understood as sort of an actual reality, right? I had a moment where I experienced this. I was in one of the poorest countries in the world where I've had the privilege of spending quite a bit of time, amazing people in this East African country called Burundi, little country in the heart of Africa. And I was walking along Lake Tanganyika, and 2 young boys ran up to me, and of course they know when they see a pale-skinned person, they usually think these are somebody who maybe I could ask for some money. And so this fellow, young boy, had a little bit of English, and he asked me for some money, and we started to chat. And then he says, "Don't mind my brother, he has a demon." And I thought, what a funny thing to say. And almost laughing, "Don't mind my brother, he has a demon." And as I chatted with him, it was clear his brother was what we would say not neurotypical. But in his context, the only language, he had never heard of autism, or the only language he had was he had a demon. And I remember at that moment I thought, see, the best language we have is the only language we have to use. And so I have problems with a lot of our traditional language to describe the human person. And so let me just offer this to you. This is an oversimplification that you don't need to take literally, but you could take metaphorically if you would like. But if you think that the human being has a long evolutionary process. I'm not just talking about 250,000 years. I'm talking about 4.5 billion years of life's evolution. And the most ancient part of us is from our ancestors who were fish and reptiles. They're the species, that part of evolution mastered what I'm going to call the survival committee of the internal board of directors of you Incorporated. Your 30 trillion or so human cells, don't think about this too much. There's another 30 plus trillion of other organisms living in you, little bacteria and viruses and so on. But of your 30 trillion human cells incorporated into one being. The survival committee is what developed a long time ago. People often call this the reptilian brain. I don't use that term because most people don't like reptiles. And so they look down on this part of your brain. I think this is, in many ways, the most highly developed part of you because it's the part of you you don't have to think about. You don't have to think, come on, keep going, pulse, keep going, keep going. It works automatically. It's evolved to work with no effort on your part. You don't have to say, oh, I got to digest my food. It just happens. If a loud noise happens, you startle, and immediately parts of your body prepare for fight, flight, reactions. That part of your body is super highly evolved, super fast, super efficient. And it's what makes, it's not just keeping you in survival, but it's what keeps the whole human species in survival. It's amazing. It's the most basic deepest part of you. And it's not all in your brain. This is where you have to stop thinking of your brain being separate from the rest of you. This part of you, the deepest part of your brain, connects to your spinal cord, that then connects to all the nerves going out, that then connect to all the other systems of your body. And it's an amazing thing, the survival committee. This part wants to keep you and your species alive. And then the next part is the part of us that developed among mammals. And we happen to develop among mammals that were herd creatures, flock, swarm creatures, social creatures. And this is the part that develops among mammals because mammals incubate the eggs inside the mother's body. And because the babies are born in such a helpless state, their survival now depends on a deep emotional attachment between the baby and the mother, and then between the baby and the father and the siblings and the aunts and uncles and grandpas and grandmas, and between the social structure of the tribe or the community. And this next part of the brain is also very ancient. It's been around millions of years. It's super highly developed. And among its many other functions, it's very much oriented toward the group that we're part of, the groups that we're part of, from our most intimate relationships to our much broader social relationships. When you walked in today, you probably weren't worried about survival. That part of your body was probably pretty peaceful. Although some of you, especially if you're not normally part of a church, you might think, am I going to like this? Am I going to have to leave? What's it going to be like? But the belonging part of you, when you walked in, was thinking, I wonder how I match up with these people. I wonder if I'll meet anybody I like. I wonder if I'll be accepted here. And that part of your brain was working so fast that you might not even have been aware of it. It's, again, deeply embedded in us, that belonging module. And then upon that, our much more recent ancestors developed our neocortex, the new part of our nervous system that is involved with very self-conscious thought. And it's able to interpret meaning in words and language and think about meaning in relationships and the meaning of survival. And not only do we have those three main committees, but there's a left wing and right wing of both committees. Now again, this is oversimplified, but there's a good bit of neurological research now that's confirming some basic validity to the idea that the left wing of your brain specializes in focused attention, and the right wing of your brain specializes in open awareness. And so if you think of yourself as having these three levels of your life that are deeply, deeply interconnected, constantly interacting, trying to work as a team with a couple of different wings that put you in different modes depending on which is dominant. Now you understand why you're so tired at the end of every day, because there's a lot of negotiation happening to keep you incorporated alive. And when we talk about the kind of issues we talked about in the first session, your survival committee was activated to say, I don't like hearing about this. I don't like hearing about things that could threaten my survival or the survival of my species. There's some anxiety that gets kicked up there. Your belonging committee gets activated when you think, hold it, this guy thinks that climate change is real and my family thinks it's not real. If I get too interested in this, I might get out of sync with my family. I won't be welcome at Thanksgiving dinner. This could create a big mess. I don't want to think about this. Do you start to see how every human being, based on our makeup, finds it hard to deal with these sort of issues? On the other hand, your survival committee might say, anything that has to do with my survival, I want to know about. And your belonging committee might say, I need to be around other people who take these sort of things seriously. I need to think about this. And I can't think fully and freely unless I'm in a group of people who will let me be part of their tribe to think about these things. We're so integrated, these different parts of us. And I think that when we're going through a time of stress and difficulty as a civilization, and a nation, we can discover practices that help us manage these three systems, regulate these three systems to help us not get overcome by panic or not get overcome by tribalism, to make us just say, I want to be around people who tell me what I already think. And the reason I wanted to give you this kind of a language or framework is to help us prepare ourselves to think about some things that most people don't think about very often. And I'd like to literally invite us to just let a little sentence kind of wash through us. What we're going to talk about for about the next 15, 20 minutes, I don't need to fix this. I don't need to agree with it. I only need to face what I'm able to face. And so I'd like to just give us a few seconds now just to be quiet and give yourself permission. You don't have to fix what we're about to talk about. You don't have to agree with it. Just face as much of it as you're able to face. And we'll just have some silence now. These practices of learning to mind our mind and pay attention to our attention and be aware of our awareness, I think it's like board training for our internal board of directors, so that we can face our future, our current situation, face these 4 possible scenarios for our future, and be ready to ask our most important question. And this matters a lot, because if we don't learn to regulate our nervous systems intentionally and wisely, we'll become increasingly susceptible to authoritarianism and other responses that are absolutely predictable when enough people's nervous systems are under stress. We can talk about that more later. So here are the 4 scenarios. This is all I really want to share for the rest of our time, and then tease out a few implications. When people face what we talked about in the first session, our current situation, everybody wants to fix it. With all the people who feel that we can fix it would say one of our scenarios is collapse avoidance. Yes, we face the possibility of collapse, but we will find a way to get enough of us to care enough and do enough to avoid a civilizational collapse. We'll fix it, we'll pull out of this mess, we'll fix enough, fast enough, deeply enough to avoid a collapse. I'll just tell you, when I began studying these issues, collapse avoidance was the only scenario I could see other than the 4th, collapse extinction. Let's go there next. If we don't face what we need to face, and enough of us don't respond fast enough and deeply enough, then we actually do face the possibility not only of human extinction, but a major, major, major extinction event on the earth. One way that people have tried to capture it is they say, we are not on the Titanic, we are the iceberg. What they mean is human civilization is knocking the whole ecological system of the earth enough out of balance that things could go very badly. And collapse extinction says that while we're going down, instead of trying to get our act together, the worst angels of our nature will show. Imagine, probably the nation on earth that gains the most from climate change is Russia. Their climate will slightly improve. they have so much land. You could imagine Russia saying, let's sell all of the oil that we have, make as much money that we have. We've got a big enough country and a small enough population. We don't really care what happens to anybody else. You can imagine the United States saying that. You can imagine the United States and Russia making a deal to work together in that. And then the devastation of then saying, let's burn all of our fossil fuels. Look, you need to know this. Back in 2012, scientists around the world said, we cannot let our global average temperature go more than 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average. We can't, because once you do that, you hit tipping points, and those tipping points then lead to things getting much, much worse. Well, in the last year, we went over 1.5. And, we might dip below 1.5 a year or two, but probably very few years for the rest of our lives will it be below 1.5. And then the only hope of collapse avoidance is that we eventually get it way down below in a way that keeps it below. But right now, we're aiming for, between now and the end of the century, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees above that global average. That's with everything that's been done since 2012. Unfortunately, with all of the attention and action pointed at overshoot and climate change in particular, we're still using more energy than we've ever used, and we're still, we haven't gotten down to the deeper issues. And what's going on in this country right now is a mass denial of any of these problems and a major regression on facing reality. Now you might say, why is that so bad, and how could that lead to extinction? When things get bad enough, when enough crops fail, when enough forests burn, when millions and millions and millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, have to leave where they live because of sea level rise, because of fire, because of famine, because of the resurgence of diseases like malaria, dengue fever, and other tropical diseases that will spread north. When all of that happens, the social unrest will be extraordinary, beyond what we can imagine. And when there's enough social unrest within countries, it increases the likelihood of wars between countries. And it only takes one idiot pressing one button to put into a chain reaction of events where other idiots press buttons. And when you get enough radiation added to the atmosphere, you create other chain reactions that we don't need to go into this morning that could lead to scenarios none of us want to imagine. But let me just say it this way. Let's say that we manage to avoid that, and 100, 150, 200, 250 years from now, the global temperatures get to 3.5, 4, 5.5, 6 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial average. At that point, you talk about ecosystem meltdown that is so great and so staggering, it is an extinction event that we humans will not be among the last to survive, we'll be among the first to go. And so that is collapse, the first and the last. In the researching of this book, I felt that there are two other scenarios that are possible. Second is collapse rebirth, that there is a collapse of this civilization, but before things get too bad, enough people then experience enough pain that they begin to rebuild, but they don't try to rebuild a civilization that is as destructive as the current one is. Now, those of you who care deeply, as I do, about social justice, you would hope the civilization they'd rebuild, they would like to have a better, more equitable distribution of power, as well as Thomas Berry said, a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. That's a collapse leading to a rebirth. And then the third is collapse survival, where there would be a collapse, but the collapse would be so total that we wouldn't be able to rebuild anything like a civilization as we know it. And the life of people who survive, probably a much, much smaller number of people, maybe 1 billion, maybe 2 billion people who would survive, and they would live in a pre-industrial state. And then you think, well, long-term future, they might rebuild a civilization. The question is, would they just rebuild another kind of destructive civilization, or would that eventually lead to rebirth? Those are your four scenarios. Now, when I wrote the book, I felt this was one of the main contributions I was making to the world of people who are grappling with these issues, to just try to make it clear enough. You could take each of these scenarios and divide them into more and less disastrous, sooner or later. So you then have 8. You could quickly make it 16. But this is a simplification that since the book came out, a lot of people who are leaders in this field have contacted me and said, this is the best description of what we face that I've heard. And so that's all I really want to share with you. We're going to go to questions in a couple of minutes, but I want to take this 4 scenarios and put it in a model that is widespread. If we were to go across the street to the university, many, many departments would have a version of this little model that I'm about to share with you. It's often called the adaptive cycle. Different disciplines have different ways of describing it. This is a model that describes star formation and death, galaxy formation and death, individual life, the stages of life, and the life cycle of an ecosystem. I was first exposed to it, 4 stages: exploitation, conservation, release, reorganization. I was exposed to it through forest succession. That, let's say, a volcano happens and a whole region is covered in magma, right? That volcanic rock that solidifies is inhospitable to life, except that a few lichens maybe manage, and algae manage to live on the rock. They die, eventually create what we will call soil, nutrients for pioneer plants to grow. Those plants die, they create more soil. Perennial plants and grasses can grow. Those plants die, they create more soil. Shrubs can grow. Eventually, short-lived pioneer trees, and eventually a climax forest. And that forest will hold on for a long, long time. For the first time in my life, a couple months ago, got to go to the Sequoia National Park and see a forest that's been around, a climax forest that's existed for thousands of years. It's breathtaking, it's awe-inspiring, but sooner or later, something happens. And that system collapses. Could happen rapidly from a fire, could happen gradually. A little pine borer beetle gets introduced, or the climate change makes it possible for them to survive in higher numbers, and it could happen gradually, but the old regime is over, and then the cycle begins. The next time it begins, though, you notice the difference between the first cycle and the second cycle. In the second cycle, there's a whole lot of soil left over from the first cycle. So the second cycle will develop a little differently, and it'll probably run its course, and then another cycle. And that's why this infinity loop has become so useful in many scientific endeavors. It helps describe this process of exploitation. There's an energy source. In this case, a lot of soil, plus sun, plus rain, an amazing set of resources available. Exploitation of resources in an energy source, then a conservation phase where a regime and a system can sustain itself, and then a release period where that system stops working anymore, and then that release period unleashes resources that then become available for reorganization into a new system. And so the question that we have to ask is, what if our civilization, and by civilization, I don't just mean our country, because we're in a unique situation in the lifetime of many of us in this room. Well, in all of us in this room, we have gone from a system where we had individual nations with individual and maybe regional trade to a global trading, global economy, globally interconnected, watching similar entertainment, having the capacity for instant global communication and mutual influence. We're at the situation of a global civilization. What if it's at the end of the conservation phase and the beginning of the release phase? Is that the end of the world? It is the end of the world as we know it. But that doesn't mean it's the end of the world for our species. It could mean that's collapse extinction, but there are other possibilities. And this, to me, if we can think about these scenarios, it gives us an amount of sanity and a framework to realistically think about this situation. Another question that arises, well, are we the first people to ever go through this before? And of course we're not. Every civilization that ever existed in the past went through these phases. For those of us who grew up in the church, one of the incredible advantages of being people who grow up with the Bible is the story of a group of people surviving the rise and fall of many different civilizations. Empires coming and going, and people being able to survive and live on. Some years ago, I discovered a really, really interesting person. Simultaneously, a Choctaw elder, indigenous community, he lives in Oklahoma, who is also an Episcopal bishop. That's not a combination you see every day. And his name is Stephen Charleston. And Stephen has written amazing books. I just feel lucky to be on the planet at the same time as Stephen. And Stephen wrote a book called We Survived the End of the World. Subtitle, Lessons from Native America on Apocalypse and Hope. One way to think about an apocalypse is the word literally means unveiling. An apocalypse is the unveiling that this empire too shall pass. And when you realize that the structures that you thought would last forever might not last forever, there's an unveiling. And it's very much that descent process we talked about of letting go and letting be. And if you're ever interested in an amazing book, this is, Stephen said this, look, you want to know how to survive the end of the world? Think about what it was like to be a Choctaw when the illegal invasion of Europeans began. And the caravans of humans from Europe came to destroy our way of life. And of course, once we become sensitive to this pattern, we realize it's happened in Christian history too. You all know the Christian faith grows up among people who are oppressed by the Roman Empire. Their dream was for the Roman Empire to collapse. You may have never thought of this before, but every dream of the Jewish people in the time of Jesus depended on the collapse of the Roman Empire, because they had no future as long as the boot of Rome was on their neck, or we might say the knee of Rome was on their neck. And in fact, at Christmas, when you read the Magnificat, go back and read it. It's in Luke chapter 2. You don't have to, it's not just for Christmas. Mary says, he's praising God. He's seeing the lowliness of his servant. I'm one of the people being oppressed by the Roman Empire. That's the subtext there. And God cares about me. God doesn't just care about powerful empires with Caesars running them and oligarchs running them. God cares about me. Because the primary story for the ancient Jewish people was that Egypt was an empire that ruled them. And their only hope was finding a crack out of the Egyptian empire so that they could go and live their own lives, not be enslaved by the empire. Well, then the Christian faith inherits this understanding. And then by the 4th century, the Christian faith and the Roman Empire made a deal. When I was a kid, I heard about it as the conversion of Constantine. I now think of it as the conversion by Constantine, where Constantine converted the Christian faith to be a religion of the empire to help it sustain its conservation phase as long as it could. And the Christian faith willingly made that deal. The bishops of the church made that deal with the emperor. If you didn't make the deal, you became a heretic. In fact, it was one of the best reasons to be a heretic if you didn't like the Roman Empire. And so the Christian faith and Roman Empire became so thoroughly joined that everyone assumed, you could say this, it was Mediterranean Christian nationalism. The Christian faith and the empire were so deeply, deeply joined. And then in 410, Alaric, the Visigoth king, invades Rome, and the Roman Senate runs for the hills and never comes back. And the Roman Empire, it's hard to say when it ended, but that was a pretty bad blow to the empire. And when that happened, 2 Christians alive at the time, we have their reaction to the invasion and sacking of Rome by Alaric. St. Jerome, first of all, said, "I was wavering between hope and despair. When the Roman Empire was decapitated, the whole world perished in one city. If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" You feel how deeply Jerome's sense of identity and well-being and even spirituality was connected to the survival of the empire. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, St. Augustine said, "Do not lose heart, brethren. There will be an end to every earthly kingdom," or we might say civilization. And he wrote a book called The City of God, among other things, to try to help people disembed their identity from the city of Rome and imagine a different identity. Now, for those of you who are theologically oriented, what I just said should get your imagination going, because what was Jesus' primary message? The kingdom or empire or civilization of God is at hand, within reach. A lot's going on there that makes sense to me now after engaging in this thought process of these last several years. A lot makes more sense than it ever did before. So what you might say is Augustine was able to step back and say, I can disembed my identity from this civilization's conservation phase, and I can accept that a release phase might happen that would lead to a reorganization phase, and maybe I'll invest more of my life in planting the seeds. Does that language sound similar? Planting seeds? Planting the seeds for what could arise when the current system reaches its end point. The most important question that emerges when we let come and let be is, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know which of these scenarios is going to happen. I see terrible disadvantages and I see wonderful disadvantages and terrible advantages to each one. Did you catch that? I see wonderful disadvantages and terrible advantages to each of those 4 scenarios. I don't know which is going to happen, but I can ask, whatever happens, how do I want to show up? And we can ask together as communities, how do we want to show up? When we go through that letting go phase and reach the letting be phase, then we start to say, then maybe we move beyond desperate quick fixes and easy answers. Maybe we can say, I don't know what's going to happen, but I want to keep my eyes open to whatever could happen. How can I disentangle myself from our current civilization and the assumptions that need to be challenged? And how can I live into the question, how do I and how do we want to show up? We'll go to questions in just a minute. But I came across this little poem that I thought was a perfect poem for these times. It's called Reasons to Live Through the Apocalypse. Sun rises. People you have still to meet and laugh with. Songs about love, peace, anger, and revolution. Walks in the woods. The smile you exchange with a stranger when you experience beauty accidentally together. Butterflies. Seeing your grandparents again. The moon in all her forms, whether half or full. Dogs. Birthdays and half birthdays. That feeling of floating in love. Watching birds eat from bird feeders. The waves of happiness that follow the end of sadness. Brown eyes. Watching a boat cross an empty sea. Sunsets. Dipping your feet in the river. Balconies. Cake. The wind in your face when you roll the car window down on an open highway. Falling asleep to the sound of a steady heartbeat. Warm cups of tea on cold days. Hugs. Night skies. Art museums. Books filled with everything you do not yet know. Long conversations. Long lost friends. And poetry. That's by Nikita Gill. And I think there's something about facing this. Some of us don't want to face it, and you can't wait to leave and not think about this again. But for others of us, the drain of not facing it has become greater than the drain of facing it. And the sense that, okay, at least I'm facing it now, in a certain sense, that opens up possibilities for us that are very, very important and help us then be ready to ask the question that we'll consider in our final session, which is, how do I want to show up? That's a good time to stop, and we have some time for some questions, same as before. And our pastor will have the mic handy for anybody who would rather not, who can't come up, but please do come up if you possibly can. That'll be an act of charity for the folks on the live stream, who we want to say hi to again and thank for being with us. Your name is?
My name is Patty.
Hi, Patty.
And this is sort of left over from the first session and kept coming in this session. The let go.
Yeah.
I can check that off. The let be and the let come is so intangible to me. And I wonder if you could tell me how let come looks in, three short sentences.
What a lovely question. Your first name again?
Patty.
Patty. Thanks, Patty. I'll get to my three short sentences in a minute. A famous philosopher, I forgot the original one who said it, was quoted by another famous philosopher named Slavoj Žižek, who said, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." And to be at the letting be and the letting come means you can imagine things you could never imagine before. So speaking personally, I can imagine, I couldn't ever imagine this before. I could imagine human beings living without money. I can imagine human beings cherishing the earth more than money. I can imagine being happier with less. I couldn't imagine those things before. And it required me letting go of things that were built into me without me consciously knowing it, just by growing up in this civilization and letting be long enough that I could start, new imagination could come. I hope that helps. We're going to look at an example in our final session today from the Hebrew Scriptures. It's very interesting. I'm going to talk to you in that third session about the role of the prophet. And we often think of prophets as people who foretell the future. I think that's a gross oversimplification. I think prophets are people who are so sensitive to the present that they begin to sense possibilities, positive and negative. So they warn us of the negative possibilities and they inspire us with the positive. And so it wasn't until their current situation got painful enough that they were able to imagine a time when we might beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks. Now, we Christians were taught to take that passage and say it talks about heaven. Come on. They have swords in heaven? They have spears in heaven? I mean, that's silly. This is a vision about a change that people are killing, so many people are killing each other with swords and spears, that it only takes things looking hopeless for the prophet Isaiah to be able, and many other prophets, to be able to imagine, I can imagine a world without swords and spears, where we stop investing in destruction and start investing in an enhanced human-earth relationship. I hope that helps. Imagination is the biggest thing I think becomes possible. Let's go to the next one.
Hi, it's Daniel again.
Thanks, Daniel, again.
So first I just wanted to express appreciation for the allusion to my theme song for this time period, which is REM's It's the End of the World as We Know It. Play that regularly. But secondly, as a professor of biblical studies and Jewish apocalyptic, I appreciate your comments on apocalyptic and prophets and how you unpack that. But I want to drill down just a bit on that. I'm somewhat ambivalent about the helpfulness of the biblical text for dealing with this. Because, and I think this is an important point, nowhere in the Bible does anyone imagine the possibility that humans can be as destructive as we are. I mean, that just was not on anyone's radar screen at all. And so, you know, the vision there and the function that destruction plays, I mean, it's generally God who destroys, can destroy everything. So I'm interested in your thoughts on what role the Bible can play and being very careful about the limitations of our biblical witness on that. And just for good measure, I'll throw in an interesting passage from rabbinic texts about the, imagining the time where you have someone, they're planting a tree and someone comes along and says, the Messiah has come. What do? You finish planting the tree because the Messiah can wait.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Oh, well, thank you so much for that. I love the Bible. I was a preacher for 24 years. I still write and teach about the Bible constantly. I love the Bible. But I've discovered that my love for the Bible is a lot like my love for my wife. You can finish that thought. And here's how it's alike. I've discovered in my marriage, the more perfect I expect my wife to be, the worse our relationship is. And the more I allow my wife to be what and who she is, the better our relationship is. And this creates a big problem for a lot of religious people because they were taught that the Bible is perfect. And perfect, I think, sets us up for a very destructive relationship on many, many levels. And this might sound ironic to say that in order to love the Bible, we have to let it be what it is. And I would say it's something much better than perfect. I would say it's good. Now, this is a line of thought that came to me when I was a pastor, and I was preaching in the book of Genesis, and I noticed how that theme, it was good, it was good, it was good, it was very good. And it never says it was perfect. And it got me interested in the word perfect, and I realized that perfect had a very deep root in Greek philosophy, but it was very different in Hebrew thought. And one way to say it, and this is an oversimplification as someone like you would know, David, but in Greek thought, perfect means incapable of being improved. To bring any change to something that's perfect means you make it worse and therefore not perfect, because nothing that's perfect can be improved. And I remember as I was thinking through this, I said, Hebrew good is better than Greek perfect, because Greek perfect is sterile and unchangeable, and Hebrew good is fertile and constantly improvable. Does that make sense? You can play around with that a little bit. That's one of the key ideas, it turns out, of something called process theology, which I think is a very fertile area that comes the more you're aware of how much changes, as we've talked about in this session. And what that allows me to do then is not expect the Bible to be perfect, but expect the Bible to be good, which means it's fertile, which means it's telling me the honest stories of the past that then helps me to face change in the past, that gives me the skills for facing change in the present and the future. I hope that helps. That's how I would grapple with that. And I really appreciate what you said. The world of the Bible is 3 or 4 universes ago, depending on how we count universes in terms of mental constructs of what the universe is. And the universe of today has many other universes that will replace it in the future, because these are constructs in our minds. And I think once we let the Bible be something good in its context, that can be used for evil. This is one of Jesus' primary insights we get in the Gospels when he realizes that the devil is quoting Scripture to him, you know. I hope that's helpful. It's such an important question. When we allow that to happen, I think we are liberated in some important ways, and we'll maybe come back to some more of them. Yes?
Steve, we're wondering if you could compare your cycle that you're exposing us to Richard Rohr's cycle of order, disorder, and reorder.
Yes. So when Richard was writing Breathing Underwater was his book where he talked about that, right? I think so. I was writing a book called Naked Spirituality. And basically, Richard was talking about 2 halves of life, and I was talking about 4 seasons of life. And I'm sure Richard's book sold a lot more than I did, because 2 is a lot easier. But then Richard modified that to 3 seasons of order, disorder, and reorder. And all I did is, in my 4 seasons, I took the order and divided it into 2 parts, of simplicity and complexity, then perplexity, then harmony. And what I think both of us were doing is saying something like this in relation to that infinity loop that I showed earlier. We're all born into a society, and our first stage in learning is to learn the rules of the society. We need to learn to survive. And that's what I call simplicity, and it's what Richard calls the first half of life. And it's what sets up the order of the social world that we live in. But and many people stay in simplicity their whole life. They stay in the first half of life for their whole life. As Richard sometimes says, they grow older, but they don't ever become elders. But then what happens is some of us begin to see problems in the order that we were given. The order that we were given killed a lot of people. The order we were given harmed a lot of people that they didn't kill. The order that we were given harmed the earth. The order that we were given wasn't so perfect. It might have been good, but it wasn't perfect. And that moves you into complexity. And then when you say, well, what do I do now with, and that complexity sets the stage for what I call perplexity and what Richard calls disorder. When the world no longer makes sense and we have to say, I need to think in a fresh way. I need my thinking and feeling and understanding to be born again, to take a phrase and put it, I think, in its proper context. And then when we try to find deeper realities to orient our thinking, then that can create the stage for reorder and harmony and maturity. So I hope that helps. Yeah. Perfect timing. One more question.
My name is Reed. I'm the youth director here.
Oh, fantastic.
As someone who was just an annoying speech and debater who read way too much Zizek to try to win rounds, and now look at how relevant he is. Thank you for the reference there. But my real question is, and it's littered throughout your book, but I'd love to hear you actually speak on it. Just some of your sort of spiritual ancestors who give you like a lot of courage in this time, just if you would be willing to speak on that.
What a wonderful way to end the morning. It's very hard to pick. I think I want to pick three. 13th century Hildegard of Bingen this visionary, I normally don't use this word, I hope it's okay to use in church, but this badass woman who just is so brilliant, and there is no place for her in the medieval world as a brilliant woman, except in the Catholic Church as a nun. You understand, women couldn't lead, at least not officially, but being a nun gave her a world of other women that they were the only people who had the room for her intelligence. And she was just brilliant polymath, brilliant theologian, playwright. She was writing literature. And a musician, to me, I'm obsessed with a contemporary musician named Jacob Collier. I'm just fascinated by Jacob Collier. And my greatest compliment to Jacob Collier is I'd say he's kind of like a 21st century Hildegard of Bingen. You know, his musical imagination just takes him to some crazy, wild places. She was just an amazing human being. And she wrote letters to bishops and told them what they needed to hear. And she used her position as a visionary woman. She basically said, I have nothing to lose, and I'm just going to say what needs to be said. And she was a poet, and she was, I just find her phenomenally inspiring. Second, obviously, not too different time period, St. Francis, who lives at the beginning of an exploitation phase. He's coming along at the beginning of economic changes in Italy that make it possible for people to change the social class in which they were born to. And that, of course, within a few hundred years will lead to what we know as capitalism. And when Francis is buying into this as a young man, and then he has a spiritual experience, and he says, I don't want to be part of this. Something about this doesn't sound right to me. And, you know, people, my Franciscan friends often speak of how he's been reduced to Francis of the bird bath. But I think Francis was this brilliant person with deep intuition and who understood that love for God and love for the birds and the wolf and the leper and other things that people didn't value in this rising era of only caring about money and status. Francis got that, and I think in that way understood Jesus in such a deep way. He would be a second. I already mentioned Thomas Berry in the 20th century. I think I would also mention another Berry, Wendell Berry, still alive. I had the opportunity to meet him once, but a person in our lifetime who I think saw many of these things far before any others did, integrated his Christian faith with his understanding of the preciousness of soil, the preciousness of the earth, and integrated these things. So thank you for allowing me to have that little reminiscence. I don't know if that did anything for you, but I feel better just thinking about those people. Thank you. This afternoon, we will turn to the question, what does this mean for our churches? And what does this mean for our work in the world? While we are in this session this afternoon, there will be people actually just down the street. Some folks are leaving from being with us to participate in a march nearby. And all I would like to suggest is if you feel you should go to the march, please feel free. And if you come, consider this is one part of the march where we're here also doing our work to imagine a better future. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for mentioning the demonstration. That's taking place in, we believe, in Friedman Park, which is just behind the post office today, if you want to participate in that. So the next thing on this agenda is lunch, which is taking place down in Social Hall. We invite you to make your way that way through the door that's out to my left and to your right. A reminder that Byron is set up down in Social Hall as well with lots of books, Brian's and others as well, that you can peruse if you haven't already. We will reconvene back here in this space at 2 o'clock. But as I mentioned before at the beginning, in case you didn't hear it, even if you did not register, there's plenty of food. So please be sure to stick around if you have any hunger and enjoy that as well. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you back in this space at 2 o'clock.